Okay, everyone heard that. So it's my great pleasure to welcome our speaker this evening, a friend and colleague from the University of Leiden, but I know her for over 10 years now. We met in Berkeley, California, at the time when we were both working on our on our PhDs. Now Sarah Cramsey is assistant professor of Judaism and Diaspora Studies at the University of Leiden in the Netherlands. She completed her PhD from UC Berkeley in 2014 and was supervised by Professor John Connolly, whom we actually started this academic year with in this seminar series. Some of you may remember our opening event back in November. And this evening, she's the author of several articles, but this evening we're going to hear about her book project, which is forthcoming very soon from the University of Indiana Press. The title is Uncertain Citizenship, Jewish Belonging, and the Ethnic Revolution in Poland and Czechoslovakia, 1936 to 1946. And I believe her talk this evening is drawn from that work. So this is a great opportunity to get a sneak preview of this exciting and I think quite important book. Okay, so Sarah is going to talk for maximum 50 minutes. Is that okay with you, Sarah? Yeah, great. And then we'll have about 40 minutes for question and answer. The way that will work is either you can put write questions in the chat, and I can ask them to Sarah, or you can write in the chat, I have a question, and I will call on you in the order in which those messages are sent. It might be nice to hear some other voices. So if your connection allows it, please feel free to say, I have a question, and then I'll invite you to speak. Okay, without further ado, I'd like to hand the mic over to Sarah. Sarah, I will be sharing your slides for you. Is that right?
That's
okay.
Great.
Okay, let me press the share screen button. All right. Can everybody see that? Yeah? Sarah, can you see that?
Yeah, sorry, 1 second. Unfortunately, when you shared your screen now, I can't see my notes. Oh, goodness gracious.
Uh-oh.
That's okay. Could you just unshare the screen for 1 second? I'll just move it to the other screen.
Okay.
Forgive us, everybody. Just some technical difficulties.
Yeah. No, this happens every time. Okay, stop share.
Thanks.
Okay.
Okay, so go ahead. Why don't you try to reshare it again, Jakub, if you don't mind. Hello, everyone.
Hang on, share screen.
We're not historians of technology here, so just bear with us, please.
All
that's
right.
perfect, Jakub. Thank you.
Is that still okay?
That's perfect. Thank you.
Okay.
So much.
All right, I'm muting now.
So, hi, everyone. I'd like to thank so much Jakub for the opportunity to present today. And I'm especially happy to be in the friendly confines of East Central Europe, even though I'm sitting here at my desk in Brussels, Belgium. And I'm happy to be in those friendly confines because the story that I'm going to tell today is really rooted in that particular region, a region that is marked by, as Milan Kundera reminds us, small states that have a common fate. And I'd like to begin my talk today with some images that are, in my mind, intrinsically linked. And I should mention, before I ask Jakub to flip forward, is that, in fact, over the course of the last few months, I've renamed the book, at least the first part of my forthcoming book, which is called Uprooting the Diaspora, Jewish Belonging in the Ethnic Revolution in Poland and Czechoslovakia from 1936 to 1946. So that's what I'll be talking about today, and that will be the title of the book. I'll circle back to this idea of uncertain citizenship if we have time at the end. So please, Jakub, if you could flip forward. Thank you. So I'd like to begin my talk today with some images. This is the first image that I'd like you to look at. And the first response might be, okay, this is a foundation moment that is being captured. Here we see the man with the white hair is David Ben-Gurion. He's flanked by his colleagues, and he's reading the Declaration of Independence of the State of Israel in May of 1948. He's doing so from an alabaster house in Tel Aviv, which you can visit, maybe not today, but as soon as travel circumstances allow. Here is a historical turning point if we've ever captured one. Arguably, this is the most shocking and unanticipated event in the history of the Jewish people, or at least that's what I tell my students. I'd like to align that picture, Jakub, please, next slide, with two maps that will be quite familiar for those of us with any background in Central Europe. First, we see here a map of pre-World War I East Central Europe. We can see here that each color on the map is representative of a different nationality / ethnicity. And Jakub, if you can go to the next slide, please. Here we have a map from 1950. And we do not see ethnic groups represented on this second map, but of course, we don't necessarily need to. Most of us know that, for the most part, political and national and ethnic boundaries have collided by 1950. Next slide, please. I call this event the ethnic revolution, or the process by which people and ethnic boundaries merge, states come to belong to a certain people, and people come to belong to a certain ethnic group. To put it another way, it's the broader nationalization of European space. Now, of course, this revolution has a very, very long arc. We can see the seeds of this revolution once nationalisms begin to hate in the long 19th century, to borrow a great book title by Brian Porter Schutz. We can situate this revolution in an even longer story about Jewish otherness in Christian Europe, going all the way back almost 2,000 years. And as all of you know, I'm certainly not the first person to study this. In fact, many of us are drawn to this region, and perhaps we're drawn to my talk because of this particular change. My book, Uprooting the Diaspora, uses Jewish belonging as a metaphor to understand this ethnic revolution. In the book, I pinpoint a special cast of characters who worked out knotty questions of Jewish belonging, and eventually decided that the reorganization of ethnicities in Poland and Czechoslovakia, two East Central European states, demanded the simultaneous embrace of Israel as an ethno-territorial state for European Jews. And I call what they embrace empirical Zionism. Next slide, please. And so today I will zoom in on a 4-year time span from 1940 to 1944 to show how both Jewish and non-Jewish East Central Europeans working in exile in allied governments, international institutions, and other non-state organizations, how they came to embrace at different times along this 4-year chronology a narrowed definition of Zionism, came to accept the idea of population transfer as a viable tool that states could use to organize populations, and then took these ideas and infused them throughout international circles, to allied power brokers, and within post-war policies that initiated ethnic unmixing in East Central Europe, transforming the Jewish citizens of Europe into the ideal citizens of a Jewish state. One group that I'm going to study specifically, which might be new to some of you, is the World Jewish Congress. This was an organization founded in 1936 and purported to represent Jews rooted everywhere in the diaspora. It does not mean that the people that joined the World Jewish Congress did not have Zionist-leaning sympathies, but they were dedicated to representing all Jews everywhere. Most of the executive committee members of this group were in fact East Central Europeans, hailing from Germany, Czechoslovakia, or Poland. Their archive becomes a key source for demonstrating this broader change, casting European Jews as belonging elsewhere. And what I'm going to do is absorb you into this world by offering you a smattering of 5 archival documents, which play an important role in my upcoming book. Now, before we get into those documents, however, these 3 caveats that I've listed on the screen, I'd like to just read through them. I won't necessarily have time to demonstrate these 3 things, but you can guarantee that my book excavates all of them. And of course, I'm happy to answer any questions about these 3 caveats during the question and answer period. So first, Zionism, we should understand Zionism as a movement, not a singular way of looking at the world, especially during the interwar period and the early 1940s, so especially from the 20s to the 30s to the 40s. We thus should not assume that Zionists or Jewish nationalists were territorially monogamous. We should not assume they were swayed by unrealistic plans for living elsewhere. And we should not assume that they're unrooted where they live. Second, by 1939, radical plans to settle European Jews and mandate Palestine or elsewhere had failed. Now, these plans were discussed by some Zionists, a certain section of the Zionist movement called the Evacuationists, which was led by Vladimir Jabotinsky, someone I'll circle back to in a moment. These plans were also discussed by anti-Semites, those attentive to German Jewish refugee issues, and those attentive to the economic depression throughout East Central Europe during the late 1930s. I'd like us to begin by considering that this Jewish diaspora in East Central Europe was rooted, and they were not going to leave this region without revolutionary methods and a revolutionary change in thought. Finally, my talk today, I've already said, will focus on the time period between 1940 and 1944. I'll talk a little bit about before 1940, a little bit after 1944. But what I won't talk about is the Holocaust per se, even though the Jewish tragedy provides a necessary context as we understand the range of options available to these actors. It's very important when we're talking about the diplomatic universe during World War II to divide what people knew from what they could accept. Having knowledge or intelligence about something is much different than being able to accept what exactly is happening. And I'm happy to talk about this in the Q&A, but I found one particular news source, Nasza Tribuna, which is a Polish Jewish diaspora emigre newspaper published in New York in the 1940s. I found that to be very helpful as I've excavated this difference between what people knew and what they could accept. Next slide, please, Jakub. Okay, so the first document I'd like to introduce you to are the minutes of a meeting written by a witness to that meeting. As far as the archival record reveals, Edvard Beneš and Vladimir Jabotinsky met just once privately in March 1940. And for those of you who don't know him, Vladimir Jabotinsky was born in Odessa and grew to become the leader of the so-called revisionist wing of the Zionist movement. He advocated for the settlement of European Jews in Palestine in large numbers, but he also noted that the diaspora would remain statistically significant, even if his wildest dreams of evacuation were achieved. What I mean by statistically significant is that upward of 2 million Jews would remain in Poland, even if Jabotinsky had his wildest dreams fulfilled. Amidst talk of practical matters, Edvard Beneš and Jabotinsky also shared a more theoretical discussion concerning the unmixing of ethnicities in East Central Europe. The topic, it seems, came up organically. In their meeting room at the former Czechoslovak embassy in London, a map of Czechoslovakia hung prominently on the wall. The Sudetenland was shaded in a dark blue color. With his finger extended, Jabotinsky asked Edvard Beneš, "What do you propose to do with them?" Them were the so-called ethnic Germans living in the Sudetenland, upwards of 3 million and several 100,000. Quickly, according to the meeting minutes, without a moment's hesitation, Beneš said, "They will have to leave. We shall have no more fifth column in our country. If an effective administration can be set up in my country soon enough after the war, these Germans will be transferred smoothly. If not, then, and Beneš shrugged his shoulders significantly. On the Jews, Beneš clearly noted that they could not be recognized as a national minority in post-war Czechoslovakia, whenever that would be. Remember, this is March 1940, because it would open the way to similar demands by others in the state and could be employed by dangerous elements and movements for disintegrating a reconstituted polity, which in fact had just recently happened at the end of the 1930s and before the Munich Agreement. And this, in fact, was not the first nor the second time that Beneš made this argument. In fact, he made similar arguments about the so-called minority treaties after the Great War at the peace talks in 1919. His thinking on the issue of minority rights had not necessarily changed. His advocacy for the population transfer of more than 3 million ethnic Germans, however, represented a revolutionary intellectual shift. Pivoting back to his own subject, the subject of his Zionism, Jabotinsky outlined his own program of voluntary evacuation of East Central European Jews away from their continental homes and towards territories in Palestine. Beneš hesitated. Perhaps Jabotinsky had misinterpreted the early part of their conversation. In fact, Beneš repudiated any idea wishing Jews away from Czechoslovakia. As an ordinary cultural or religious minority, Jews could live happily. They could never, however, take the form of a national minority again. While both Beneš and Jabotinsky envisioned the ethnic homogenization of East Central Europe, they had different priorities within this overall plan. Jabotinsky spoke about Jews. Beneš spoke about Germans in Czechoslovakia, but he also remained vaguely adamant that Jewish belonging in post-war Czechoslovakia would change from its interwar form. In essence, however, both of these men dreamed similar dreams. So only 7 months into the Second World War, both Beneš and Jabotinsky considered population transfers, either when applied to an irredentist German minority in the Czechoslovak context, or attached to plans to shepherd Jews towards a presumed Palestinian homeland, as viable and acceptable solutions, recasting the heterogeneous post-World War I nation state in the region. According to this calculus, international norms protecting minority rights and discouraging the forced or voluntary movements of politically vulnerable human groups would shift to encourage the ethnic reorganization of populations in East Central Europe. Now, the logical extension of this shift when applied to Jewish populations necessitated the simultaneous embrace of a Jewish polity in the Middle East for these Jews that would be leaving. Jabotinsky could, of course, already envision this. He had for most of his adult life. While Beneš did not necessarily speak about this contingency at this moment in March 1940, he would soon speak about a Jewish state in the Middle East in strikingly absolute terms that would gravely concern officials in the World Jewish Congress. Jakub, could you flip to the next slide, please? This brings me to my second document, which is in fact a cluster of documents showing that Edvard Beneš and his new views about Jews and where they belonged in an eventual post-war Europe were in fact quite threatening to actors within a Jewish organization that was committed to representing the idea that all Jews in the diaspora could choose where they live. On November 20th, 1940, so a few months after this meeting between Beneš and Jabotinsky, World Jewish Congress representative and member of the Polish government in exile, Ignacy Schwarzbart, offered his readers in London and New York a warning. In an internal memo sent between World Jewish Congress offices, Schwarzbart cautioned that prominent and responsible politicians of one of the defeated states in Central Europe were considering future policies demanding that Jews will either have to be part of the ruling population or get Palestinian citizenship, in which case they would be treated as foreigners. These ideas had originated, according to Schwarzbart, from someone considered to be 100% democratic and could potentially spread to other countries. Now Schwarzbart decided it is the time to watch this danger point. Like the interwar Czech political elite and his Czech Jewish colleagues, 1 year into the war, Schwarzbart continued to subscribe to this myth of Czechoslovakia as a liberal and democratic island whose progressive Western Czech leaders held out against the anti-democratic and chauvinist nationalist forces that engulfed the rest of Central and Eastern Europe in the interwar period. I've already mentioned that Beneš was not necessarily a huge fan of minority rights going all the way back to the end of the First World War. But still, there's this perception that if Beneš is saying these particular things about Jews needing to go to a Jewish state somewhere else, that it's going to be even more problematic if someone who isn't considered as democratic is saying that. 5 months later, another internal report of the World Jewish Congress explicitly warned that Beneš and his views had now become a persistent problem. After Czechoslovak citizen and World Jewish Congress employee Dr. Lev Zalmanovitz visited Beneš twice in March 1941, so 1 year after the conversation with Jabotinsky, Zalmanovitz declared to his colleague Ari Tartakover that Beneš was, in his assessment, the biggest problem we face. Let me cite from a private letter that Zalmanovitz wrote on the heels of this internal memo that he sent out. Beneš had, according to Czechoslovak and World Jewish Congress leader Lev Zalmanovitz, Beneš had his own idea concerning the solution of the Jewish question in Europe. After the war, all countries should help in establishing a Jewish state. Beneš is certain it will be Palestine. After the Jewish state is established, all Jews will have to decide either to be absorbed in the Jewish nation or in the nation of their homeland. In the first case, they will be citizens of the Jewish state, aliens in the other countries, and should be immediately transferred to a transit country. Our principle should be, Zalmanovitz wrote, to persuade Beneš that his conception is wrong. And finally, an in-person meeting between 3 World Jewish Congress officials and Edvard Beneš solidified the idea that Beneš was a threat to the World Jewish Congress's idea of the post-war world. And while at this meeting, Beneš offered a reassurance that he personally had not changed his principles with regard to the Jewish question in general, or with regard to Czechoslovakia in particular, the officials that met him were worried that Beneš was making a mistake by comparing the Jewish minority of Czechoslovakia with other minorities. According to a London member of the World Jewish Congress who met with Beneš in the spring of 1941, the Jewish minority question differed entirely from the German one, as there is no territorial nation behind the Jews. In response, Beneš admitted the difference, but insisted that as a matter of principle, all the minority questions would have to be settled simultaneously on the principle of minority representation. Just as he did with Jabotinsky more than a year earlier, this apparently is something Beneš did more than once in his meetings, he referred to a map that he had conveniently brought with him, explaining that a country such as Czechoslovakia could not exist if another national group such as the Germans laid claim to the country's territory. In direct response to the World Jewish Congress's insistence on differentiating the Jews from other minorities, Beneš proposed that the civilized world will find a reasonable settlement of the Jewish question after the war, and that he and his government would do their best to facilitate this. Okay, so from these documents, this document number 2, or this cluster of 3 sources, in 1940 and 1941, we can see that the World Jewish Congress, again, an organization purporting to represent all the Jews living throughout the diaspora, is staking their version of post-war plans on a reintroduction of minority rights in the region, not on population transfers. They're staking their post-war plans on the presumed continued rootedness of the Jewish diaspora in the region. This slowly begins to change, and not only because news of the Jewish tragedy starts emerging. The story that I'm trying to tell here has to do with that, but it also has to do with changing international norms and the possibility of a political opportunity that was not present before. Jakub, please. This brings me to document number 3, another set of meeting minutes from something called the American Emergency Committee for Zionist Affairs. And the picture that you're looking at here, forgive me for not identifying Edvard Beneš a few slides ago, the picture that you're looking at here is a gentleman, Dr. Nahum Goldman. And I'm going to talk a little bit about something that Nahum Goldman, who is one of the 2 leaders of the World Jewish Congress, says in a particular meeting of this committee that took place on June 1st, 1941. Before I get to Nahum Goldman, though, I'm going to talk a bit about Chaim Weizmann. So World Zionist Organization leader Chaim Weizmann had many thoughts on June 1st, 1943, but none of them directly related to the imminent conclusion of the so-called Conference on Food and Agriculture that would eventually become the beginnings of the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration. Chaim Weizmann was depressed, and he bared his deepest regrets to the American Emergency Committee for Zionist Affairs that assembled in New York on that day. The Bermuda Conference had failed. The Warsaw Ghetto was no more. And when Chaim Weizmann spoke, he responded to these two crises of epic proportions with both anger and disbelief. Due to leave America after a year-long stay, Chaim Weizmann viewed the situation in the Zionist movement with the utmost gravity. The fact, he declared that, and now I'll quote from him, European Jewry was being decimated and poses quite different problems. Where will the millions of Jews come from who are to go to Palestine? There may be perhaps 1 million or 1.5 million Jews left to immigrate, but the wisdom of talking in very large figures seemed unquestionable. Notice why he's depressed. He's not necessarily depressed only because of news of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. He's depressed because of the problems the decimation of European Jewry pose to his plan to have hundreds of thousands, if not millions of Jews moving eventually to the Middle East. Since the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 of the Common Era, the Jews have never faced so tragic a period. Dr. Weizmann said, he was due to depart the United States imminently, and he planned to leave with a heavy heart. In summation, as far as the Jews were concerned, on June 1st, 1943, Hitler has won the war, and Hitler's poison has spread deep. Weizmann's very frank comments elicited, as you can imagine, a variety of responses, including a notable one from this gentleman here, Nahum Goldman. As I've already mentioned, one of the two leaders of the World Jewish Congress, along with the American Jewish leader, Stephen Wise. The main uncertainty facing Jews and Zionists remained, for him, a question of which step should be taken first, namely, should the establishment of a commonwealth or the initiation of emigration constitute the greatest priority? When recently asked by a member of the US State Department which platitude of the so-called Biltmore program he would immediately choose, Goldman replied that he would ask for the immigration of 500,000 Jews in the 2 years immediately after the war. He strongly believed that the US State Department and Great Britain would accede to the demand for the immediate immigration of 500,000 Jews before they would endorse the creation of a Jewish Commonwealth. Quite simply, according to Nahum Goldman, the formula should be that all those Jews who have been uprooted from their countries and have to be cared for immediately after the armistice should be assisted by the United Nations. The uprooted Jews should not be forced to return to their country of origins, nor to be dispersed. When he made this statement in June 1943, Goldman directly recaptured words that Weizmann himself had spoken at the end of December in 1942 in the confines of the same committee. Goldman reminded his colleagues that there will be a tremendous job of housing, feeding, and transportation, which, if successful, will lay the basis for the demands for a self-governing Jewish Commonwealth. In Goldman's assessment, immediate immigration of Jewish refugees should be the primary demand for all in the Zionist movement, and soon for the World Jewish Congress as well. Most importantly for our analysis, the relief bodies of the United Nations in Weizmann and Goldman's proposal, which had not even been fully formed yet, should be financing this immigration. On November 1943, so a few months afterwards, the first meeting of the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, otherwise known as UNRWA, grew out of this food committee that had recently assembled before Goldman gave his talk. The World Jewish Congress sent a few non-voting members to this Congress, which took place in Atlantic City. One of those members was Ari Tartakover, and they went to lobby on behalf of Jews. They mentioned this formula that Nahum Goldman had mentioned in this meeting amongst Zionist leaning parties. But this was not the formula they necessarily prioritized. And in fact, the first meeting of UNRWA obscured more than it clarified. Across the community of East Central Europeans, both Jewish and non-Jewish who were living in exile throughout the Allied world, red flags emerged from UNRWA documents, albeit for very different reasons. Jakub, could you please get to the next document? And I'll remind everyone that I'm going to talk about 5 documents. So look at that, we're more than halfway there. This brings me to document number 4. The Czech Foreign Office reacts to the first meeting of the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, which took place in November of 1943. And so the document comes from the Czech Foreign Ministry archive dated January of 1944. The World Jewish Congress sent Ari Tartakover and a few others to Atlantic City for this first conference. Czechoslovakia sent, among others, Joseph Hans and Jan Masaryk to Atlantic City. Like other representatives to this event, Foreign Minister of Czechoslovakia in exile, of the Czech government in exile, Jan Masaryk, received a mailing from the British arm of the World Jewish Congress soon after his return from New Jersey. The mailing was entitled The Atlantic City Conference of UNRWA. It was printed by the World Jewish Congress in London in January 1944. And this memorandum garnered the attention of at least 2 Czech Foreign Ministry employees working in London exile under Masaryk's charge, Zdeněk Procházka and Hubert Rybka. Both men left evidence of their readership on the worn flyer in the form of thin wobbly underlining, thick red highlights, and their signatures. Ideas concerning the repatriation of DPs, or displaced people, to their countries of residence and to other countries willing to accept them attracted their black and red pens more than other issues. So what's great about this document, finding this document in the Czech Foreign Ministry archive, is that it really tells 2 stories. First, of the people in the British arm of the World Jewish Congress that wrote it, and then second, of the 2 men that read it and decided they were going to highlight it and put their notes on it. So in this sense, it's illuminating of 2 very different groups of people that are, of course, all kind of working in the same East Central European milieu. One of the 2 men in the Czech Foreign Ministry underlined that displaced populations constituted the most acute rehabilitation problem. So agreeing to a certain extent with the World Jewish Congress. The UNRWA Council and the subcommittee that was dedicated to displaced persons did not specify any protocols for Jews, instead advocating that the sole rule of procedure in the case of deportees should be their repatriation, and that repatriation should mean solely the return of United Nations citizens to their countries of origin. The British section of the World Jewish Congress noted a fatal flaw in this logic, as did these 2 readers in the Czech Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Both readers drew attention to the next section, declaring that many Jewish refugees after the war will not find it possible or will prefer not to return to the countries or homes from which they were removed, and who should be by every rule of justice aided to thus resettle elsewhere. As a corrective, the World Jewish Congress British section proposed that the repatriation of deportees can take the form not only of returning citizens to their country of origin, but also of returning displaced residents who were not citizens of their country in question to the countries of their settled reference. So what does this mean? The British World Jewish Congress wanted UNRWA to make their proposed solution to the larger DP problem more lenient. In this way, personal choices could gain leverage, whereby citizenship would not be the deciding factor animating repatriation schemes. Also, the World Jewish Congress in London was worried specifically about Jews who came from areas that would not necessarily be ceded back to the states where they had their citizenship. So parts of Eastern Poland that could potentially stay in the Soviet Union, parts of Eastern Czechoslovakia that could potentially be ceded to the Soviet Union. What would happen to these people Their place of settled residence was in a new state, but their interwar citizenship was in a different state. Now, some of these ideas seem to really disturb Prohaska and Rybka, not necessarily because they wanted to impede the resettlement of European Jews, but because they wanted to ensure that German nationals would be excluded from post-war Czechoslovakia. For clarification of this issue, they turned to meeting minutes that were written by another Czech delegate to UNRWA named Josef Hans. In reading over the subcommittee minutes dealing with DPs that Hans had referenced, Rybka noticed that a slight change in wording could potentially inhibit Czechoslovakia's ability to control the ethnic makeup of the repatriated population to their state. In an early meeting of the Subcommittee for Displaced Persons, those assembled confirmed that nationals of United Nations states or stateless people should be repatriated to their countries of residence, provided these countries are willing to receive them. So removing the agency from the individual and putting that agency more within the hands of the states themselves. Rybka agreed with this formulation, whereby the individual states ultimately decided on the process of repatriation. However, in a subsequent subcommittee meeting, the language did not necessarily guarantee the same level of state autonomy. So you can see there's a contest here. Who gets to control where repatriated people get to go back to, as long as they're not deemed enemies, let's say, of that state? In fact, in the final version of this subcommittee meeting minutes, the will of individual states was completely erased from the repatriation equation. Instead, UNRWA would work in consultation with member governments to assist in the return of nationals of United Nations states and stateless people who had been displaced as a result of war to their countries of settled residence. The prerogative of individual states was absent in this formulation. Rybka saw this change as intensely problematic. Why? If an individual state like Czechoslovakia could not control the displaced Germans filtering back to their pre-1939 Bohemian and Moravian or Sudetenland homes, then Czechoslovak plans to expunge the body politic of the German national element would be threatened. Prohaska offered clarification. While he registered Rybka's concern for this serious situation, he considered patience the best possible response. Prohaska promised to ask Jan Masaryk, their bosses, for guidance moving forward. Nearly 5 weeks later, Prohaska had spoken to Masaryk about Rybka's concerns, and Masaryk had offered clear directives about what was written in the World Jewish Congress pamphlet. Masaryk promised that the expulsion of Germans will be our own affair, despite the formal adoption of UNRWA proposals indicating the contrary. So here, we have a document sent after the first meeting of the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration about Jewish populations. But in the confines of the Czech Foreign Ministry, it becomes a lens on broader Czechoslovak policies towards Germans and other ethnic minorities in general. And it follows, you can see, that by backing plans for a Jewish transfer to Palestine, this backing could reinforce other plans for the expulsion of ethnic Germans. And I laughed when I first read this, because very rarely do red pens or those kind of markings on documents give me as much clarity as seeing these arguments laid out next to each other. This brings me to the last document that I'd like to share with you. So Jakub, if you don't mind, I appreciate you moving forward. This is a committee meeting and the minutes from this committee meeting between World Jewish Congress executives, many of whom we've already met, and the so-called German Jewish Representative Committee, one of the constituent committees of the World Jewish Congress, made up of German Jews that are living in exile. This is really a fascinating document, and I could have spoken for the entire 50 minutes, and I have in other contexts, just on this particular document. And the reason why it's such a wonderful document and such a fascinating document, especially in the realm of diplomatic history, is that you really get a sense of the personalities of the people that are involved. And perhaps even more importantly, you can feel ideas changing within this document. You can feel the people, the 10 or so men that are sitting around the table in Nahum Goldman's apartment, overlooking Central Park West in the summer of 1944, you can feel these people grappling with the intelligence they're receiving, the discussion they're having, the idea that they have to make some kind of policies or put forth a certain statement. And they're trying to figure out what they're going to say in response to one particular question, which is, should the World Jewish Congress support the return of German Jews to Germany after Hitler's defeat? And it's incredibly exhilarating after reading through reams and reams of diplomatic documents, which sometimes aren't very personal or aren't very emotional, to have a document that exudes those emotions and really kind of speaks to the gravity of the decision that these people seem to think that they're making. Should they support en masse the return of German Jews to a post-war Germany? What should the World Jewish Congress say about that? And what are the implications depending on what they do decide? So this special meeting was originally scheduled for April 26, 1944. So a few months before. And it was convened after a regular meeting of the Office Executive Committee, which happened at 1 o'clock that afternoon. And it's important for me to clarify what these gentlemen had just learned. So at this meeting at noon, so the meeting before this meeting, Ari Tartakower, a Polish Jew on the World Jewish Congress Executive Committee, he relayed new intelligence that he received from the Polish government in exile. One, the Jewish National Committee in Warsaw had received the $20,000 sent by the World Jewish Congress. Number two, a transport of 7,000 Jews from Terezin had arrived at the, quote, famous extermination camp in Oswiecim. And number three, perhaps most horrifically, the first transports of Hungarian Jews deported to Poland had already arrived there and were sent immediately to extermination camp. So these bits of depressing information sat alongside a more general optimism that everybody felt regarding the June 6, 1944 D-Day invasion that took place just 2 days earlier. So there are about 10 people involved in this meeting. I'm going to focus on 3 voices, all members of the executive committee, and all of these voices were born in East Central Europe on territory between Berlin and Moscow. And I'm choosing these voices because they seem to really conflict, let's say, the most. So near the beginning of the meeting, Maurice Perlzwig, an executive committee member of the World Jewish Congress, stated succinctly, "He who goes back to Germany goes at his own risk." This Polish-born resident of London served the World Jewish Congress as the head of the Division for International Questions and chairman of the British section. Notably, Maurice Perlzwig harbored fears that Jews returning to Germany would become entangled with overall retribution and incur punishment targeted for the non-Jewish German population. While he conceded it is a human right to go back, he who does it must meet the German fate, and the World Jewish Congress cannot defend him. For him, the German case was different than allowing return or endorsing return, let's say, to Belgium, Czechoslovakia, or France. Germans will become targets after the war. Jews in Germany will become targets as well. Following Perlzwig's example, Nahum Goldman also decided, apparently for the first time in all of their meetings together, and these gentlemen, depending on their travel schedules, met together at least on average 3 to 4 times a week. So these are people who are really seeing each other quite a bit as part of the executive committee of the World Jewish Congress in New York City, in between the travels they're making and the intelligence gathering trips that they're taking to places like Washington or London or elsewhere. So Nahum Goldman decided that he would also reveal his personal opinion. Reflecting on the draft of the statement of policy before him, which was put forward by the so-called German Jewish Representative Committee, Goldman, the man who in fact accompanied Perlzwig when Perlzwig had first arrived to the United States in 1940, respectfully disagreed with his colleague. Goldman also disagrees with those who advocated an evacuation from Germany. If, Goldman argued, we were against a return only to Germany, this would be a triumph for Hitler. Germany would become Judenrein, free of Jews, and this would happen with the approval of the World Jewish Congress. Moreover, if the World Jewish Congress dismissed return to Germany as a viable option based on German aggression and acquiescence to German extermination, what about other countries where Jews were also killed? Other countries, according to Goldman, such as Romania and Hungary, had murdered Jews as well. And if the World Jewish Congress bans Jews from all these countries, the organization would essentially destroy Jewish life in the diaspora. On the contrary, Nahum Goldman believed that the greatest triumph of Jewry would be if Jewish rights in Germany would be internationally guaranteed. We have a right, he stated, in a democratic world to live wherever we want. How could these statements coexist with Goldman's equation of Jewish survivors with potential Palestinian emigres that I talked about 2 documents previously? Understanding Goldman's support for a post-war German Jewish community hinges on our ability to differentiate between those Jews who want to return to their pre-war homes and those who decide to relocate elsewhere. It seems that Goldman sought in this particular discussion to protect individual choice, regardless of where the individual chooses to abide. Perhaps for this reason, Goldman remained against a mass evacuation, despite being able to understand the logic behind it. For him, each Jew possessed the prerogative to live in Tel Aviv, Warsaw, or even Berlin. Interestingly, he continued to have this opinion until the end of his life, well into the 1970s. Finally, whereas Goldman refused to take away options, Ari Kubovitsky saw only one. At the previous meeting that the World Jewish Congress executive had had with this group, Kubovitsky defended the idea of a policy statement encouraging the return of Jews to Germany. So he had been in favor of it roughly a year before. Now, however, quote, "We are driven by the terrible force of events to proclaim a ban on Germany," unquote. Kubovitsky asked out loud, why had he changed his mind? He was a founding member of the World Jewish Congress. He still considered himself a supporter of Jewish life in the diaspora. He also stood opposed to the idea of collective responsibility. He realized that many Germans have helped Jews at the risk of their own lives. And he also recognized that there are other people besides Germans who have not behaved very well. More practically, he envisioned all the difficulties we would have to face if a ban were proclaimed because of the mere fact that Germany is in the heart of Europe. Just 1 year prior, Kubovitsky had believed that the masses of the German people did not know the details of the horrible massacres of helpless old people and children in which their kinsfolk participated. But now no doubt is possible anymore. Ordinary Germans, he admitted, must have been informed through innumerable channels, and yet not one outstanding German tried to come out of Germany in order to disassociate himself and his people from these crimes. Moreover, a year ago, we did not know the appalling dimension of the exterminations. We knew that hundreds of thousands had been killed. We did not know that we had lost the 2/3 of the Polish Jews. In fact, it was really more. We have finally hoped that we would save Hungarian Jewry, but the Nazis do not give us any respite. They are bent upon killing all of us. Recall that he had just heard reports about the Hungarian transports headed towards Auschwitz just a few hours earlier. History, Kubovitsky declared, imposes upon us the obligation of giving an answer to what happened in our existence in these historic times. The answer must be commensurate with the magnitude of the tragedy. This was different than normal wars. This was different than average pogroms. This was an apocalyptic occurrence, and it demanded that he and his colleagues give an answer to the world, not only to the Germans. He must bring back to his Belgian neighbors a Jewish answer which should be adequate, striking, and majestic. And this answer should be dramatic enough to shake the world and to give our people the moral support and respect of the nations of the world. This discussion, which I've introduced you to here in my last document, it really tugged at the heartstrings of all involved. It caused Kubovitsky and another one of his colleagues to reverse their previous decisions, their previous opinions, and they were reversing them in opposite directions. It also reveals how complicating the crafting of organization-wide policies could be, especially when emotions ran high. Almost all of the participants in the three that I vocalized certainly had very close yet contentious ties with Jewish life in East Central Europe. Now, in a broader sense, this particular discussion demonstrates how members of the World Jewish Congress Office Committee's relationship to the diaspora and the overall Zionist movement had changed over just a few short years. Language calling for the movement of uprooted Jews towards Palestine, with little attention to individual choice, was no longer ostracized. Even calls for mass evacuations found space in this discussion. In sum, a range of opinions existed, and there was no committee-wide consensus which easily emerged. The document reveals, however, that minds were changing and had changed in a variety of directions. Goldman ended the discussion with a reminder that the final decision regarding the return of Jews to Germany would remain with the so-called World Jewish Congress Emergency Conference, which would convene in Atlantic City later that fall. And so the War Emergency Conference of the World Jewish Congress would come, but the second UNRWA meeting, this time in Montreal, occurred first. There, committees related to displaced people failed to do two things. They failed to enshrine people persecuted for Jewish or racial reasons in UNRWA law and policy, and they failed to come up with a solution for DPs who could be repatriated to the country of their citizenship, but could not be returned to their original homes because their homes were now in other states. So these two problems, which have already been highlighted by the British section of the World Jewish Congress and the Czech Foreign Ministry, remained problems throughout 1944. One response was to advocate that these displaced people, especially the Jewish ones, be able to use the process of repatriation to go to new homelands. And for the Jewish case, of course, this represented to many people's minds Palestine. So what are some of the broader takeaways here? By the second meeting of the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, the World Jewish Congress begins to publicly advocate for the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine as the ideal solution to the displaced person problem. They also lobby for a distinction in United Nations law for Jews as a uniquely persecuted group. And essentially by doing this, they're reproducing the Nuremberg laws of 1935, basically saying that this is how we're going to define Jews. It's going to be based on the way that they were persecuted during the war. And further, they come to endorse a plan for the United Nations to subsidize the resettlement of Jews from Europe to Palestine as part of the broader unmixing of nations and repatriations. In the late 1930s and the early 1940s, the refrain for the World Jewish Congress was decidedly rootedness. By December 1944, when the War Emergency Congress of the World Jewish Congress convened, the refrain was Hatikva, which means the hope in Hebrew and is usually considered to be the national anthem of the modern day state of Israel and was an anthem of the Zionist movement. Nahum Goldman promised that he was not calling for an evacuation from Europe. But in his next breath, in a speech that he gave in Atlantic City, he declared that the only solution to the Jewish question was Palestine. In his remarks, the leader of the British section of the World Jewish Congress, Noah Barrow, stated that no Jewish evacuation of Europe is one of the most important things for the World Jewish Congress to say clearly and pointedly. This must be an unequivocal statement so that there will be no confusion about it. But then in his next breath, he spoke about Palestine being the only center toward which all the Jews who want to leave Europe could come. Ignacy Schwarzbart, who we heard from earlier when he talked about the threatening ideas of Edvard Beneš, noted that we haven't the right to order that European youth should want to go to Palestine. We should ask them what they want. And then, like everybody's least favorite parent, he dictated what the want of the youth should be. It is our hope that if they can enjoy the sunshine and beauty of their rightful home, if they can walk hand in hand with own parents through the streets of a city which belongs to them, conscious of a national pride, then we will have achieved our purpose. Those refusing to call for the so-called evacuation of the Jewish diaspora and specifically the East Central European Jewish diaspora, seemingly did just that. The nuance and disagreement evident in the earlier meetings of the World Jewish Congress Office Committee, and specifically captured in this document on June 8, 1944, had dissolved into a more simplified and unified program. Palestine first, the diaspora second. After seeing the resolutions of this War Emergency Congress put on by the World Jewish Congress, it should come as no surprise that the German Jewish Representative Committee issued a ban on the collective return to Germany of the German Jewish community. And they did that at the beginning of 1944. And in doing so, the World Jewish Congress moved closer to Benesch and others in East Central Europe who wanted to ensure that the post-war world would not have states replete with minorities. So that's where my document trail stops. I have a few more things to say about the broader takeaways and the broader impacts of some of these decisions that were made amongst allied governments, United Nations committees, and the World Jewish Congress, most specifically related to the so-called Bricha, or the semi-legal movement of Jews, mainly from Poland, but not only from Poland, through Czechoslovakia and away from Europe, and to what extent this ethnic revolution had an impact on that movement. But I'd rather, let's say, since I've been talking for about 15 minutes, stop and give everybody a chance to ask some questions. And then if I have a chance, I can go through some of the other impacts. And then I have a bit of a coda if people are interested on basically what this means for East Central European culture overall. So yeah, I guess Jakub, you can stop the PowerPoint and I'll open the floor for questions. If people are still awake.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for that really stimulating talk. Yes, it's 6 o'clock, so we have about half an hour for questions, or precisely half an hour for questions. And I would invite people to ask questions in the chat, or you can also raise your hand. I can never find the raising hand function on Zoom. You can also write in the chat, I have a question, I'll call on you. While people are formulating their thoughts, I just maybe could take the opportunity to ask a question or two myself. I think this is a really interesting and important book that you've presented us today. I think it shows, well, to me, it shows a couple things. First of all, it shows how kind of persistent and resilient the idea of diaspora Jewish life was until very late indeed, right? So we kind of assume the unviability of the diaspora at this point, looking back. But even in the midst of the destruction of European Jewry, it was still a quite important and persuasive idea, really. So I think that's one thing that I found really interesting. Another thing is the entanglement of this ethnicization of Zionism, you could say, with plans for population transfer in East Central Europe, and you point especially to the Czechoslovak case and the role of Edvard Beneš as this kind of totemic figure in thinking about population transfers. But that leads me to a question. I mean, did the diaspora mean different things in Poland and Czechoslovakia? And did this impact the ethnic revolution in different ways? That's one question I had. The other question, going kind of off the fifth document that you talked about, you mentioned this news of the Hungarian transports as a kind of tipping point in the decisions of the World Jewish Congress, right?
Or at least for Kubovitsky at this moment.
who you present as a kind of seminal voice, right? I mean, why was why was this news such a tipping point? And then finally, I'm not seeing any questions pop up, so I'll ask my third question.
You're intimidated, Jakub. These are such great questions. You're intimidating everybody.
I'll ask the kind of job interview question is, even though you already have your job, what is the contribution to the historiography of this book? How does this fit in what are you adding or challenging in the existing historiography? So
sure, great questions. Those of you that don't know, Jakub and I have been friends for many years, as he said in a scary way, almost a decade. So he knows that if he's not asking me about historiography, I'm going to leave completely unsatisfied from this talk, because that's exactly the question that I want to get. So first, this idea of diaspora, and how are we supposed to understand the concept of diaspora across these two very different Jewish populations, these two very different states, Czechoslovakia and Poland, and then also this idea of diaspora in general. This is a really, really great question. And the way that I've thought the most about this concept of diaspora, of course, the word diaspora in itself is so incredibly ironic. For me to say that the Jewish diaspora has been rooted in the region of East Central Europe for roughly 900 years by the 1940s. How can a diaspora be rooted? And, we're kind of falling into the trap that certain types of nationalists or certain types of Zionists would want us to fall into, which is by using this word diaspora, which in fact has a lot of different meanings. It can be a liturgical meaning, that Jews living outside of the land of Israel have to do certain things on holidays that you don't have to do if you live in the land of Israel, for instance. Let's keep in mind that one of the most important documents, of course, in Jewish history, the Babylonian Talmud is a document that's documenting a particular diaspora. Daniel Boyarin has a book looking specifically at this idea of what we know about Judaism and Jewish life and practice. Is in fact, it's more about the diaspora than it is about the center or the supposed homeland, right? And one way that I've kind of worked through this idea of diaspora and tried to show, Jakub, you're right to mention this, that we should imagine these populations as being rooted and viable populations that want to be in these areas, want to be in Poland, want to be in Czechoslovakia. In 1926, for instance, the net migration to mandate Palestine. Now, of course, it's difficult to get there, it's expensive, you have economic issues in the 1920s, the British mandate is controlling who gets to enter, all of those things. The net migration to Palestine, mandate Palestine, in 1926 was 10. That's not 10,000, that's 10. That's keeping in mind the people that are leaving and the people that are coming, because of course this is a very, very difficult place to live in. So when I think about the diaspora, and I think about rootedness, I think about it on a bunch of different levels. I think about it in local terms, in regional terms, and then in more kind of intellectual terms. What does it mean when you have a minister like Josef Beck, who comes out, a leader of Poland, saying, we want to find ways to move Jews somewhere else? And you as a Polish Jew, you're kind of like, okay, well, maybe I wouldn't mind necessarily moving somewhere else, especially depending on where I was in life. But the idea that you're going to uproot upwards of 3 million people and move them somewhere else, I mean, these are just completely unrealistic plans. And even when cornered, Jabotinsky has to concede that even in his wildest dreams, if he gets to move as many Jews as he wants to, there's still going to be 2 million Jews living in Poland, 10 years after he starts his so-called evacuation. So, I think that this idea of diaspora, it cuts through the way that we talk about Jewish history and or minority history in general, and that's a worldwide phenomenon, but most specifically in this particular region. And one of the things that I'm so interested in the way that I teach Jewish history, for those of you that missed where I am, I'm actually in a religious studies department. I'm trained as a historian, but I teach Jewish history as a history of interactions. And you can only really understand Jewish history and Jewish populations by understanding how Jews interact with people who do not follow a Jewish way of life. And one of the things that I was so interested to find in the research for this book, which has taken me to so many different archives on so many different continents, is all of the cross-pollination and all of the discussions that were being shared, that weren't being shared, and how this issue of the diaspora and the issue of Jewish belonging becomes a very important metaphor for understanding what people want their country to look like if they have the revolutionary conditions to bring it forward. I'm heavily reliant on Ronald Schechter's excellent book, Obstinate Hebrews, where he talks about the role that Jews have in the discourse surrounding the French Revolution, the National Assembly, all the way up through Napoleon. What does the Jew mean for a European historian, and what can we learn, by thinking about this idea that we still call it a diaspora, even though, as I mentioned, Jews had been rooted in Poland for upwards of 900 centuries, despite the fact that, of course, there were migrations, especially disrupted by pogroms in the wake of the First World War and the First World War itself. In terms of this question of the tipping point with regards to the meeting that I referenced on June 8th, 1944, and Jakub specifically asked me to talk about this news that Hungarian Jews were now being deported en masse to the extermination camp of Auschwitz-Birkenau. This gets back to a point that I raised earlier, which is when we talk about the Holocaust and what these gentlemen, because they're mainly men that I'm working with, what they knew and what they were really able to accept. It's quite interesting to try to see what grasp of knowledge that they had over what was transpiring in Europe. So for instance, in October 1943, Ignacy Schwarzbart, the Polish representative on the World Jewish Congress Executive Committee and a representative on the Polish government in exile, sent Ari Tartakover the following telegram. We have to come to grips with the fact that there is complete annihilation of Polish Jewry. This is October 1943. And those of us that know anything about the Holocaust know that most Polish Jews have been, upwards of 90% of Polish Jews have been killed by the end of 1942. So this is over, 10 months later. And the numbers that Schwarzbart gives are, there are between 200,000 and 1.2 million Polish Jews left. I mean, that is quite a range when we think about the intelligence that these people are really able to get. Now, with regard to this particular meeting, I think it's incredibly important that this meeting takes place being delayed a few months and that it's done on the heels of this idea. Because of course, looking at the broader Nazi universe and which governments are collaborating with the Nazis, when do the Nazis begin to execute the final solution in some places, particularly in Romania and Hungary. Those of you that know anything about Auschwitz-Birkenau know that the train tracks that kind of come into the Birkenau camp, they were built specifically for the extermination of Hungarian and Romanian Jewry. They weren't necessarily there before, the spring of 1944. And this seems to me indicative of them realizing, these gentlemen sitting in New York City, realizing that it's no longer about the war effort. It's no longer about, the resources that are necessary for this genocide. This is extermination. This is complete extermination. And they thought that somehow these Jews would be saved given the fact that they were living under a collaborating regime. But it does seem to be that is a very important tipping point, at least for this particular meeting. But again, one thing that I've been shocked to see is how knowledge just does not translate into full awareness. And for a lot of these gentlemen, Ignacy Schwarzbart being one of them, Zorek Bar-Haftig being another, Ari Tartakover being another, it's not until they get back to Europe after the war in 1945 and they meet with people when they begin to realize it's all gone. It's just all gone. And so, it is an important tipping point to a certain extent, but I think we have to be very delicate. I have about a 10-page portion in the book where I talk a little bit about what we know as historians, what they knew and how we're supposed to kind of reconcile awareness with knowledge. And finally, historiography. It seems to me that I contribute to broader discussions of nationalism in the region of East Central Europe, trying to understand specifically how Jewish nationalism changes, especially in the 1940s, also situating Jewish nationalism, Zionism, and the creation of the State of Israel, situating that as a European story. really making sure that the state of Israel is seen as a mono-ethnic state like Poland, like Czechoslovakia, emerging, I should say a presumed mono-ethnic state, because of course we know that it's not, emerging out of these particular movements of the 1940s. I see myself speaking, of course, to people that are interested in the formulation of international policies that are endorsing population transfers at the expense of minority rights, and this very important shift in international norms. I have an article that I wrote on the Polish nation state and their policies towards the Ukrainian minority, which of course was the largest minority in interwar Poland, upwards of 5 million Ukrainians in the 1920s and the 1930s living in Poland, and how the Polish state changes their policy towards the Ukrainians towards a population transfer policy, which with movements like Operation Wisła or Vistula in 1947, because of a shift in international norms. And finally, it's to kind of, I look around at the Jewish history that I teach and the long arc of Jewish history and Jewish belonging. And I really want to problematize ideas like the diaspora, ideas of rootedness, ideas of Jewish belonging. And like I said at the beginning, to understand this crazy event that happens in 1948. And I say crazy because to a certain extent, it's just unfathomable, unanticipated, unfathomable. How does a Jewish state emerge in May of 1948 in this region? And how does this idea that European Jews should inhabit it and that the new United Nations should pay for them to inhabit it by, creating this population transfer situation? Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. Thinking about the kind of prehistory of 1948, we have a question from Andrew Thorpe written in the chat here. He asks, what impact had the Balfour Declaration had in creating increasing interest in the Jewish people's return to Palestine? The World Jewish Congress doesn't seem to have been much moved by the Balfour Declaration, or had it been?
So this is a great question. What's the name of the person that asked it, Jakub?
Andrew Thorpe.
Thank you so much, Andrew. So for those of you that don't know what Andrew's talking about, the Balfour Declaration is in fact a letter that was written in 1917 from Lord Balfour, which is basically saying that the government of Great Britain will look with favor on the establishment of a Jewish national home in Palestine, as long as that establishment does not infringe upon the rights of existing populations. And this letter is seen as a very, very key moment in the broader Zionist movement, whereby you have here a great power, Britain, which of course is about to take over control of the area of Palestine as the Ottoman Empire is hemorrhaging. So this is seen as a big bonus, a big move for the Zionist movement, insofar as the British Crown is going to look with favor on this particular movement. And there's a lot of hope, lots of celebrations throughout Europe and throughout the world, in fact, for people that have Zionist leanings or are part of, let's say, the World Zionist Organization. Number one, we shouldn't necessarily assume that because someone is part of the World Zionist Organization or because someone was excited by the Balfour Declaration, that they would very, very quickly uproot themselves and move to Palestine, which of course was not the easiest place necessarily to move to. Ari Tartakover, who I mentioned, an executive in the World Jewish Congress, tried to move to Palestine in 1923, I believe, and he got malaria and decided to come back to Poland quite quickly, because malaria is just not the type of thing that it's easier to treat these days, but still it's quite a condition if you've ever had it. So you're asking specifically, Andrew, about the World Jewish Congress's response to the Balfour Declaration. And I can offer that response very quickly. There was none, because the World Jewish Congress did not yet exist. It came into existence as an organization in 1936. But of course, there were predecessor movements and organizations to kind of bring together Jews that were interested in protecting the rights of Jews living throughout the diaspora. And in fact, within the World Zionist Organization itself, there is a movement to not only build up a Jewish national home, but to at the same time be protecting Jewish rights in the diaspora. So we should not necessarily assume that a Zionist with a capital Z wouldn't necessarily be in favor of continued Jewish existence in a place like Poland or elsewhere. Mark Levine has written a really great book. I think it was his first book on Lucian Wolff, a very important diplomat who was a key figure in the drafting of the Balfour Declaration. I believe it's called The Diplomacy of Lucian Wolff, War, Jews, and the New Europe. And what I like so much about that book is he really kind of, if you enjoyed my presentation, I think you'd like his book even more because it's even denser than what I presented to all of you. He really tries to see how people with different ideas of supporting Jews in the diaspora or not, how they would react to, let's say, the Balfour Declaration. So of course, the Balfour Declaration is a really important moment, but we should not, assume that it's kind of an end all or be all statement of the British government or the British colonial office, because of course, what you find, especially as we move into the 1930s, increasing restrictions on immigration, not just of Jews, but of everyone going into the mandate, the mandate Palestine. And in fact, almost a revocation of the Balfour Declaration, which is why I said by 1939, any kind of grand plans to move tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands. I've spent so much time reading through colonial era documents of how many people, new immigrants, the land could support, let's say. Let's just say it's really not that many when it comes down to it. There needs to be quite a lot of infrastructure being poured into Mandate Palestine. One of the things the World Zionist Congress wants to do is build on that infrastructure. This, of course, is still something that we're dealing with today when we look at Israel and the Palestinian territories. How do we unite these two, sometimes quite separate policies under, like water infrastructure or these other kind of environmental issues that are broader. But I thank you for the question. But the short answer is the World Jewish Congress had no response because it didn't exist yet. And in fact, the Balfour Declaration was not as poignant by 1939 as it was in 1917.
Thank you. Well, we have about 10 minutes left. I'd invite anyone who has any questions or comments to come forward.
Reveal yourselves if you have questions or comments, Jakub is trying to say. If I were in person, I would just walk up to random people and say, do you have a question for me? I feel like I can't do that as well. I can't bully my audience as well as when it's on Zoom.
Well, back to the idea of the diaspora. I'm curious. How much space in the book do you devote to kind of understandings of the diaspora and sort of even sort of thinkers of the diaspora like Simon Dubnow or people like that?
Excellent. So Jakub has just mentioned a very, very important person. In fact, Simon Dubnow, who was from the Russian Empire, a member of the World Zionist Organization, he actually was the first person at a World Zionist Organization event to state the need for an organization like the World Jewish Congress. And in fact, Simon Dubnow, who was also a historian, so those of you that want to geek out about fellow historians, it's always great to find historians that are historical actors. One of the important founders of an organization called the YIVO, which is a collection of documents of Jews of Eastern Europe. He, in fact, attended the first meeting of the World Jewish Congress in Geneva in 1936 and gave a few speeches while he was there. So, this idea of diaspora, like I said earlier, what I like so much about this concept is it cuts across all time periods and also regions of Jewish history. So what I like so much when I teach my broad survey course, oftentimes historians of the Jewish experience, no matter when they specialize in, they have to teach a broad survey course, let's say from Adam to Bernie Sanders, right? So Adam being the first man, Bernie Sanders being the curmudgeonly mem who has really great mittens, who is a senator from the United States and ran for president. So when I teach my course, I have to start with creation. I start with God creating Adam, and I go kind of all the way up to the present. So it's incredibly liberating for someone who has written a book that focuses on 10 years to be able to walk into a classroom and say, aha, guess what? Now I have about 6,000 years to play with. And like Yosef Yerushalmi talks about the rabbis in his great book, Zachor, I kind of take time like an accordion. and I compress it and I extend it depending on what my purpose is in that class. And that means somebody, you know, Josephus from the from the Second Temple period can have a conversation with Maimonides, you know, 1,000 years later in my mind and the documents that I'm populating. So, you know, I spend quite a bit of time talking about the diaspora in the introduction of the book. A lot of it, unfortunately, was relegated by the reviewers to footnotes. But the reason I did that is because in my courses, I look at this kind of broad swath of chronology, and I try to understand how the idea of the diaspora is changing over time. And of course, you can look at Jewish life throughout history and see many very important centers that diasporas then emanate from. Here in the Netherlands, for instance, we can look at the diaspora from the Iberian Peninsula and how that gives rise to all of these great, you know, Portuguese-styled synagogues all over the place. It gives rise to, you know, the family that gives birth eventually to Baruch Spinoza, right? So what's great to me about this concept of diaspora is that you're really able to play with it a bit, and it gives me a certain chronological scope. It also allows me to kind of look at the way that Zionists use this word and see that as it's historically contingent. You know, when I read through what some Zionists are writing, I see no difference between someone like Theodor Herzl and František Palacký, right? One of the founders of Czech nationalism, the way that they're trying to, you know, justify the eternalness of their nation. And I think one of the interesting aspects that I bring to my teaching of Jewish history is that I come to Jewish history as an East Central or East Europeanist, as somebody who wants to focus on those particular languages. So by looking at those languages, by using documents with those languages, of course, I use Yiddish and Hebrew in my book as well, but most of the documents that I'm quoting are in Polish and in Czech. And that's going to change the way that you think about the diaspora. It's going to change the way you think about rootedness, because it changes the conversation that these people are having when they're not having them just in, let's say, Jewish languages. It makes it very difficult to have conversations with people not following a Jewish way of life if you're not speaking in certain languages. And one thing we should keep in mind for both the Jewish populations of Czechoslovakia and Poland by the end of the 1930s, these are populations that are, number one, exceedingly young. Upwards of 40% of the Polish population is under the age of 25 by 1939. Number two, these are populations that have spent a generation within a particular nation state where they're hearing Czech and Slovak and Polish, as well as other languages, of course, but they're having the opportunity to go to school in those languages. And number three, these are people who don't necessarily see the economic ability to necessarily move. There might be, you know, there's, as Joseph Roth says, everybody has an uncle who's moved to America, right? But these are, you know, larger families. We're talking pre-birth control, of course. My new topic is on family, so I'm all about birth control in the 1930s. I'm happy to answer any questions about that if those come up as well, or the next time you invite me. But these are big families. These are young families, and these are families that have been increasingly Polonized and Czechified. And I talk a bit about this in the conclusion of my book when I reference Milan Kundera's 1984 article in the New York Review of Books, The Tragedy of Central Europe, when he talks about, as a Central European author, he sees his lineage through Jewish Central European authors, many of whom have come of age in the Habsburg Empire. But, you know, kind of this liminal space, these multi-ethnic, this multi-ethnic world that we in fact lose to a certain extent when we move towards this hyper-ethnicized version of nationalism. I have a student right now who's writing a great thesis on the case of Max Brod before the Israeli Supreme Court, and this question of who gets to own Kafka. Does Israel have a right to own Kafka? Does Germany have a right to own Kafka? What about the city of Prague? I mean, if Kafka's writings are going to be anywhere, I feel like they should be somewhere in the city of Prague, hopefully where someone can, you know, quickly have a beer and laugh about them, because I feel like that's what he would want. But this idea of Mittel Europa and what that means for Jewish history and what is lost, and what it means when we talk about Jews within a diaspora, thereby not being rooted in that particular place.
Excellent, thank you. And yeah, I think, I mean, sort of to reiterate something that you said, casting this shift away from the diaspora to the kind of narrowing of options and focus on Palestine as the destination, rooting, sort of showing that as a European story is really important, but also more specifically as a kind of Czech and Polish story, I think is a real contribution. Yes, thank you for putting that citation here in the chat. Well, excellent. I think we're coming towards the end of our session here. If there are any final questions from the audience, comments, please blurt them out now. Otherwise, please join me in thanking Sarah Cramsey for a really terrific and wide-ranging presentation to finish off this term's. Let's all give a round of applause.
I see all of your names, and the next time in London, I'm expecting a beer from all of you. So I've written them all down, and lest you think you're going to get out of not buying me a pint.
Well, usually we repair to the back of the Masaryk room and down a glass or three of wine, which we can't do, of course, but
next
time. So thank you all for coming. Thank you, Sarah. I'm going to stop the recording now. And
I'll just say, of course, please, if I can be of any help to anyone, any questions, we're very close from Leiden to UCL, if that's where some of you are. Please let me know if I can answer any questions, or if you want to add something that I've mentioned to your syllabuses. I'm happy to, of course, share documents, and please stay in touch. It would be lovely to meet all of you, and I thank you for your attention, and I apologize for not being able to say hello in person.
And buy the book. Okay, I'm stopping the recording now.